The first use of a semicolon is the boring one. So, you know how commas are used to separate items in a list? Well, semicolons separate multiple lists in one sentence, kind of like a beefy comma. That actually taps into their main use, which is to connect two independent clauses into one sentence. If that also didn't make sense to you, in English, a clause is the most basic kind of sentence. It has a subject and a predicate being at least a verb and maybe something else. For instance, I ran, where I is the subject and ran is the predicate. In I ran home, I is still the subject and ran home is the predicate. It's a verb and a direct object. Commas are used, among many other things, to connect independent clauses to dependent ones. Independent clauses are the ones like I just went over, and dependent clauses don't have all the necessary parts to be a clause. For instance, because of the weather, I had to stay home. The second half makes sense. It could be its own sentence, but because of the weather makes no sense on its own. There's only a noun here, no verb or anything else. So we add what's called a preposition to connect the idea of the weather to us staying home. Prepositions are these sorts of words because, after, unlike. We tack them to dependent clauses to connect them to the rest of the sentence. You could flip this example around and write it as the weather was bad, so I had to stay home. Notice that we had to turn that first half into a full independent clause with a verb and a direct object to do it. Now that we have an idea of how to write both halves as independent clauses, we can even rewrite it to just be two separate sentences. Just, the weather was bad, period. I had to stay home. Cut out the preposition entirely. But we don't like doing this in English. When we use a period, it usually signals a break between two ideas. When you only write in short, simple sentences separated by periods, it gets choppy. Ideas that should flow together don't. So, if we have two independent clauses that could totally be their own sentences, but we don't want to break them up with a period, what do? This is where you have the option to use a semicolon. The weather was bad, semicolon, I had to stay home. It's not the greatest example because it's so brief, so let's bulk it up a bit. The rain had turned the ground into a slurry of mud, sure to stick to my shoes. Leaving now would just guarantee washing them later, and I just didn't want to bother after such a long day. Here, I could replace the semicolon with a period, but as the writer, I want to establish a closer connection between the two ideas. And that's important to make note of. I don't have to use one. This is why a lot of people never learned what they do, because there aren't many situations where you actually need to use a semicolon the same way you need commas, periods, and apostrophes. Semicolons are unique in that they're mostly an artistic choice by the writer. Some people like using them more, some people less. It's honestly a stylistic thing. So if you've never known what they do, don't feel bad. I just hope this video lets you add semicolons to your own writing arsenal, in case you do think they're neat. I love using semicolons in my own writing. They're easily my favorite punctuation. Full stop. It's funny because full stop is technically a period.